Welcome to Sleepytime Stories, where we listen, we relax, and drift into a world of dreams. My name is John Bush. Tonight, I have a special story just for you. The Painter's Heart. An artist paints a mysterious stranger in his dreams, only to meet her in real life one day. So, get cozy, close your eyes, and let your imagination take flight. The night was thick with silence. Outside, the city hummed in the distance. Cars moving, sirens wailing, life continuing as usual. But inside Ethan Carter's small studio, time felt frozen. A dim lamp flickered in the corner, casting soft shadows over unfinished canvases. The smell of oil paint and turpentine lingered in the air. Ethan lay in bed, his fingers still stained with colors from the day's work. His eyelids grew heavy, his breathing slowed. And then, she appeared. A woman, standing in the middle of a vast, empty space. She wasn't just beautiful, she was haunting. Dark waves of hair cascaded over her shoulders. Her deep brown eyes held secrets older than time itself. Her lips, slightly parted, looked as if they wanted to speak but never did. Ethan held a paintbrush in his hand. He didn't question it. He simply began to paint. The strokes came naturally, as if his hands had memorized the curves of her face long ago. He moved quickly, yet with precision, bringing her to life on the canvas. And as he worked, something inside him ached. Who was she? He had never met her. Yet she felt more real than anyone he had ever known. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. He dipped his brush into the deep blue paint and began. Stroke by stroke, she emerged. Her eyes came first, dark, endless, holding a story just beyond his reach. Then her cheekbones, soft and delicate. Her lips, parted as if she wanted to whisper his name again. The moment he finished, his stomach twisted. It looked exactly like her. But something felt wrong. Her expression was different than before. This time, she seemed to be watching him. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding. He hadn't meant to paint her like this. He had only just begun, hadn't he? His hands were still wet with paint, but the portrait looked finished. He didn't remember painting the last few strokes. His throat tightened. The smell of turpentine was overwhelming now. He pressed his palms against his temples. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe he was losing his mind. No. Something was happening. Something he couldn't explain. The studio door creaked open. Jesus, Ethan, You look like hell." Ethan turned to see Michael, his best friend, standing in the doorway. Michael was the kind of guy who never let anything bother him. Casual, confident, always with a coffee cup in hand. But the moment he looked at the painting, his easygoing smirk faded. "Damn," Michael whispered. "That's intense." Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah." Michael walked closer, tilting his head. "You've been working on this all night?" Ethan hesitated. I don't remember finishing it." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "I started it, but it's like my hands kept moving without me." Michael's brows furrowed. "You're exhausted, man. You've been obsessed with this woman, who, by the way, does not exist." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he believed that anymore. Michael sighed. "Look, maybe you need a break. Some fresh air. Hell, go on a date or something." Ethan forced a dry laugh. "Right. I'll just tell my date that I've been painting a woman I see in my dreams. That should go well." Michael shook his head. "Just don't lose yourself in this, okay?" Ethan nodded, but as his friend walked away, his gaze drifted back to the painting. And his stomach dropped. Something had changed. The woman's lips, he swore they had been closed before. But now they were slightly parted. As if she had just spoken his name. The air in Ethan's studio felt thick. He stood frozen in front of the painting, his breath uneven. He knew that her lips had been closed when he had stepped away. Now, they were parted just slightly, as if caught mid-whisper. His chest tightened. "Michael," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Footsteps approached, then stopped. "What is it now?" Ethan pointed at the canvas. "Look." Michael frowned, stepping closer. "At what?" "The mouth," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. Michael leaned in, examining the painting. "What about it?" Ethan swallowed. It wasn't like that before. Michael sighed, rubbing his face. "Dude, you're exhausted. Your brain's playing tricks on you." But Ethan wasn't convinced. He knew what he had painted. Michael clapped him on the shoulder. "Listen, man, take a break. Get out of this studio for a while. Get some actual sleep." Ethan nodded stiffly, but his mind was far from rest. That night, he tried to sleep. He really did. But the moment he closed his eyes, the dream pulled him in. He was standing in a dark corridor. The air was thick with the scent of oil paint and something else, something ancient. The walls stretched endlessly, lined with paintings. And there, at the very end, she stood, waiting. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped closer, his movements slow, cautious. Her eyes gleamed in the dim light, deep brown pools of something unreadable. She lifted her hand, fingers ghosting over his face as if memorizing him. Then she whispered, "Ethan." A shock ran through his body. She had spoken before in his dreams, but this time, he felt her breath. His vision blurred, the walls around him distorting. The paintings seemed to breathe, shifting under some unseen force. His heart pounded as the woman's voice grew softer, fading into the darkness. Then, everything went black. Ethan woke up with a gasp. His skin was damp with sweat. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. The clock on his nightstand read 3:07 a.m. The room was silent, the only sound his ragged breathing. But something felt wrong. The air smelled like paint. His gaze darted to the corner of the room, his easel, his canvas. His breath caught in his throat. The painting had changed again. Her lips were now fully parted. And beneath it, in faint, delicate strokes, a name had appeared. Lilith. Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't written that. Ethan stared at the painting. His breath felt shallow, his chest tight. Lilith. The name was scrawled in thin, delicate strokes at the bottom of the canvas. The paint looked dry, as if it had been there for hours. But he hadn't written it. His fingers twitched. Slowly, he reached for a paintbrush, intending to smear the name away, but the moment the bristles touched the canvas, a whisper filled the room. Soft. Faint. Like a breath against his ear. Ethan. His entire body seized. The brush clattered to the floor. He spun around, heart hammering against his ribs. The studio was empty. His pulse roared in his ears as his eyes darted across the dimly lit space. The lamp in the corner flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls. He swallowed hard. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. He was sleep-deprived, overworked, obsessed with a woman who did not exist. Right? Right? A chill crawled down his spine as he turned back to the painting. Lilith's lips seemed to have changed again. They weren't just parted now. They were curved, as if she were smiling. A cold smile. Ethan took a step back. No. This wasn't real. With shaking hands, he grabbed an old sheet from a pile of supplies and threw it over the painting, covering her face completely. His skin prickled. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. He needed air. He needed out. Ethan didn't remember leaving the studio. One moment, he was inside, suffocating under the weight of something he couldn't explain. The next, he was outside, the cold night air biting his skin. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional distant honk. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and walked, his mind a mess of static. Lilith. Who was she? And why did he feel like her name had always been in his head? He thought about calling Michael. About telling him that things were getting worse. That the painting was changing on its own. That he was hearing whispers in the dark. But what would he say? Hey, Mike. I think my painting is alive. Also, I might be losing my mind. Yeah. That would go well. Instead, he kept walking. Block after block, his feet carried him through the quiet streets of the city. The neon lights of bars flickered in the distance. A group of strangers laughed on a sidewalk patio. Life moved on as if nothing was wrong. As if he wasn't falling into something he couldn't explain. Then, he saw her. Lilith. Ethan froze. There. Standing across the street, beneath the glow of a flickering street lamp. The same dark hair. The same deep brown eyes. The same haunting beauty. His heart stopped. She was real. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Lilith stood beneath the flickering street lamp, her dark eyes locked onto his. The cold night air suddenly felt suffocating, pressing against his chest like an unseen weight. This wasn't possible. She wasn't real. She had been a dream. A whisper. A face on his canvas. And yet, here she was. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. The shadows from the street lamp cast shifting patterns across her face, making her look almost ethereal. Ethan swallowed hard. His feet felt rooted to the pavement. His heart pounded in his ears. Move. Say something. But before he could speak, she turned and started walking away. Panic surged through him. No, wait. His voice came out hoarse, desperate. His legs finally obeyed, and he ran after her. She moved quickly, slipping into the narrow streets beyond the main road. Her dark coat blended into the shadows as she turned a corner. Ethan followed, his breath sharp in the cold air. Turn after turn, she stayed just ahead of him. The city around them grew quieter, the streetlights dimmer. Then she stopped. At the end of a long alleyway, beneath the glow of a single overhead light. Slowly, she turned to face him. Ethan's chest rose and fell rapidly as he took a cautious step forward. Lilith. A flicker of something crossed her face. Amusement. Recognition. He couldn't tell. You know my name, she said softly. His stomach tightened. Her voice was just as he had imagined, low, smooth, laced with something undeniably familiar. He hesitated, his pulse hammering. I don't understand. How? Lilith smiled. A slow, knowing smile. You've been painting me, she murmured. Haven't you? Ethan's mouth went dry. How do you know that? Her eyes darkened, gleaming under the dim light. Because, Ethan. She took a step closer. I've been dreaming of you too. A chill ran down his spine. This was impossible. It had to be. Yet, deep in his bones, he felt it. This wasn't the first time they had met. It wasn't even the second. Who is Lilith? And why does it feel like Ethan has known her forever? If you're just as hooked as Ethan is, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that unravel mysteries in the dark. Now, let's continue. Ethan stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lilith's words lingered in the air between them. I've been dreaming of you too. His mind raced, searching for logic, for something that could explain this impossible reality. But there was nothing, only the weight of her gaze, the steady hum of the city in the distance, and the sharp, electric feeling in his chest. How? He finally whispered. Lilith smiled, but it wasn't a simple smile. It held secrets, something deep and unreadable lurking beneath it. I don't know, she said, her voice smooth, low. I only know that I've seen you before, many times. In dreams. In shadows. And then, tonight. I felt you. Ethan shivered. This was insane. And yet, he knew she was telling the truth. I painted you before I even knew you existed, he admitted. Lilith's expression didn't change. She only studied him, like she was trying to pull his thoughts straight from his mind. Ethan felt the pull of something unseen, something that wrapped around his chest and refused to let go. Who was she? Why did it feel like he had known her for a lifetime? A cold wind rushed through the alleyway, making Lilith's dark hair flutter around her face. She stepped closer. "You're afraid," she murmured. Ethan stiffened. "No," he said, but it was a lie. Lilith reached out. Her fingers hovered inches from his wrist, close enough for him to feel the heat of her skin, but she didn't touch him. "Not yet." "Something brought us here," she said softly. "Something we don't understand." Ethan swallowed. He should walk away. He should. But instead, he asked, "What do we do now?" Lilith's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected the question. Then, for the first time, her certainty faltered. "I don't know," she admitted. For some reason, that made Ethan's fear ease, just a little. He took a slow breath. "Then let's figure it out." Lilith studied him for a long moment. Then, she finally touched him. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, light as a whisper. And the moment they did, a shock of heat raced through Ethan's veins. The city lights blurred. The air grew thick, charged with something electric. His breath caught, and for a moment, it felt like the world had shifted, like something ancient had stirred awake. Lilith's eyes widened. She felt it too. The connection. The pull. Neither of them knew what it meant. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back now. The moment Lilith's fingers brushed against Ethan's wrist, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just warmth. It wasn't just the sharp jolt of recognition. It was as if a thread, invisible, ancient, unbreakable, had tightened between them. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. His body stiffened, his skin prickling with something electric. Lilith's lips parted slightly, her dark eyes locked onto his, searching, questioning. "You felt that," she murmured. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The air between them crackled. The night suddenly felt too still, too heavy, like the world itself had paused to watch them. Ethan swallowed hard, willing his voice to be steady. What was that?" Lilith didn't answer right away. She studied him, her brow slightly furrowed, like she was listening to something beyond the silence. Then, softly, she said, "I don't know. But it's not the first time I've felt it." Ethan stiffened. His heart pounded as he took a half-step closer. "You mean?" Lilith nodded. "In my dreams. Every time I saw you, I felt it. Like a pull, dragging me toward you. Like, she hesitated. Like I've known you before. Ethan felt something twist in his chest. Because he had felt it too. Even before she appeared in his dreams, even before her face took shape under his brush, he had always felt like something was missing. Like a piece of him had been left in a place he couldn't reach. And now, standing here with Lilith, that missing piece was looking right at him. A gust of wind rushed through the alley, sending a shiver down his spine. He exhaled, trying to steady himself. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "None of this makes sense." Lilith smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." And yet, here they were. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, glancing around at the dimly lit alley. "Where were you going?" he asked. Lilith hesitated. "Nowhere, really. I just ended up here." Ethan frowned. "I don't believe in coincidences." Lilith gave him a knowing look. "Neither do I." The weight of that truth settled between them. Slowly, Ethan let out a breath. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he said, "Come with me." Lilith's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. A hesitation. A choice. "Where?" "My studio." Lilith tilted her head slightly, considering. Finally, she nodded. "All right." Ethan wasn't sure why he wanted her there. All he knew was that he couldn't let her disappear. Not again. The walk back to his studio was quiet. The city hummed around them, cars in the distance, neon lights buzzing, footsteps echoing down empty sidewalks. But Ethan barely noticed any of it. All he could feel was her presence beside him. Real. Solid. And yet, somehow, unreal. Lilith didn't say much. She walked with a quiet certainty, like she had done this before. Ethan stole a glance at her, trying to make sense of it all. Who was she? Why had he dreamed of her before he even knew she existed? And why, deep down, did he feel like meeting her wasn't the beginning, but the continuation of something much older? They reached the studio. Ethan hesitated before unlocking the door. For some reason, his heart pounded. He pushed the door open. The familiar scent of oil paint and turpentine greeted him, the dim glow of the studio lamp casting long shadows over the room. Lilith stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the space. Her eyes landed on the covered painting in the center of the room. Ethan swallowed hard. The painting of her. She turned to him. "Can I see it?" Ethan hesitated. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Then, slowly, he reached for the sheet and pulled it away. Lilith stared. A long silence stretched between them. Ethan's chest tightened. "Say something." Lilith took a slow step forward. Her eyes traced over every brushstroke. The soft curve of her lips, the depth in her eyes, the way the shadows kissed her skin. It was her. Exactly as she was. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She exhaled shakily. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Ethan swallowed. "It's you." Lilith turned to him, her expression unreadable. "How did you paint me, Ethan? How did you know my face?" He shook his head. "I don't know." Lilith held his gaze. Then, softly, carefully, she whispered, "I think we've met before." Ethan felt something click inside him. A truth he hadn't wanted to admit. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think we have too." A silence fell over them. Not uncomfortable. Not empty. Just charged. Like the moment before a storm. What does this mean? How can two strangers share the same dreams? If you're just as lost in this mystery as Ethan is, make sure to like and subscribe. There's more to uncover. Now, let's continue. The weight of Lilith's words hung between them. "I think we've met before." Ethan exhaled slowly. He had felt it too, that eerie familiarity, that pull. But the rational part of his mind still refused to accept what his body and soul already knew. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lilith turned back to the painting, her fingers hovering just above the dried brushstrokes. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's not just the dreams, Ethan. It's more than that." Ethan clenched his jaw. "More than what?" Lilith hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, she looked at him, her gaze dark and certain. "Have you ever felt like you were waiting for something?" she asked. "Like your whole life, you've been missing a piece of yourself, but you didn't even know what it was until you saw it?" Ethan's stomach tightened. "Yes. God, yes." But he wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. Lilith sighed, turning back to the painting. "I started dreaming of you months ago," she said softly. "At first, it was just flashes, your face, your hands, the sound of your voice. But then the dreams became more." Ethan swallowed. "More how?" Lilith glanced at him, hesitating. "They felt like memories. A sharp chill ran down his spine. Memories. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and careful. What do you mean? Lilith's fingers curled into fists. I mean that when I close my eyes, I see places I've never been before. I feel things I shouldn't remember. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. And you're always there. Ethan's breath caught. Lilith searched his face. Tell me I'm not crazy. Ethan exhaled shakily. If you are, he murmured, then so am I. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The studio was silent except for the distant hum of the city outside. The air was thick, heavy with something neither of them could name. Then, Lilith did something that made Ethan's pulse stutter. She reached for him. Slowly, carefully, her fingers brushed against his. And the moment they touched, the world shifted. A sudden rush of sensation slammed into Ethan's mind. Not memories, but something deeper. A feeling. A knowing. It was as if his soul recognized hers. His breath came in short, sharp bursts. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. Lilith gasped. Her grip on his hand tightened, her eyes widening with something like shock. You felt that, she whispered. Ethan could only nod. Lilith took a step closer, her fingers still wrapped around his. Ethan, I don't think this is the first time we've met. Ethan's throat was dry. Then when? Lilith swallowed hard. I don't know, she admitted. But I think we've known each other before. A tremor ran through Ethan's body. That was impossible. And yet, deep down, in the part of himself he had always ignored, he knew she was right. The night stretched on. Neither of them moved. Ethan's mind was a mess of emotions, tangled between fear and an unbearable need to understand. Lilith slowly released his hand, though the warmth of her touch lingered. What do we do now? He asked. Lilith's gaze was unreadable. We find out the truth. Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding. Because he couldn't walk away now. Whatever this was, whatever connected them, it wasn't finished yet. Ethan couldn't sleep. Hours had passed since Lilith left, but her presence still lingered in his studio, in his mind, in his very skin. He sat before the painting, her painting, his brush hovering over the canvas. Something was missing. Something vital. His fingers tightened around the brush. The more he looked at it, the more it felt incomplete. which didn't make sense. Every stroke, every shade, every detail was perfect. Her eyes, her lips, the soft curve of her shoulders. And yet, the painting felt like a puzzle with a missing piece. Ethan exhaled sharply. His pulse was erratic, his chest tight with a strange, almost suffocating energy. This wasn't just art anymore. It was something else. Something deeper. Something unfinished. The next morning, Ethan barely touched his coffee. His mind was fogged with fragments of dreams he couldn't quite grasp, flashes of golden light, distant laughter, the touch of soft fingers against his cheek. Memories. Or were they dreams? He didn't know anymore. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ethan stood slowly, a strange sense of anticipation crawling over his skin. When he opened the door, Lilith was standing there. She looked different. Not in any obvious way. Her dark eyes were the same, her lips slightly parted as if she had just whispered his name. But something in her had changed. She looked troubled. "I need to show you something," she said. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Lilith hesitated. Then, softly, she murmured, "My painting." Ethan felt his breath hitch. He stepped aside, letting her in. Lilith walked past him, her eyes flicking to the canvas he had been working on. She paused, staring at it for a long moment before turning to him. "It's unfinished," she said. Ethan stiffened. The certainty in her voice sent a chill through him. He swallowed hard. "I know." Lilith studied him, her gaze piercing. Then, slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it carefully. Ethan's heart stopped. It was a painting. A painting of him. And it was unfinished. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. His throat went dry. His voice came out hoarse. "You painted this?" Lilith nodded, her expression unreadable. Ethan stared at the canvas. It was him, but not just a simple portrait. There was a depth in the eyes, a familiarity in the way his face was shaped, the way his expression held something ancient. And just like his painting of her, something was missing. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening at his sides. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured. Lilith met his gaze. "No," she whispered. "It doesn't." A silence stretched between them. Then, Lilith took a slow breath and said, "I think we need to finish them." Ethan hesitated. "Why?" Lilith's gaze darkened. Because I think when we do. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. We'll remember. 2 paintings. 2 souls. And a truth waiting to be revealed. If you feel the tension in the air like Ethan does, make sure to like and subscribe. The mystery is only deepening. Now, let's continue. Ethan and Lilith sat across from each other in the dim glow of his studio, their unfinished paintings between them. The air was thick, electric, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Lilith picked up her brush. "We paint," she said. Ethan hesitated. Something about this felt important. More than just finishing a piece of art. It felt like a door unlocking, like a whisper from something ancient. Like fate. Still, he dipped his brush into the paint. And as soon as the bristles touched the canvas, a rush of something surged through him. He wasn't in his studio anymore. He wasn't even in this time. The world around him shifted. Ethan gasped, his breath stolen by the overwhelming flood of memories. No, not memories. A life. A grand hall. Stone walls covered in rich tapestries. The flicker of candlelight casting shadows across the polished marble floor. He was standing there, dressed in garments he did not recognize, deep crimson robes embroidered with gold. A ring on his finger, heavy with a symbol he somehow knew but could not name. And then, a woman. Lilith. Only she wasn't Lilith. Her hair was longer, woven into intricate braids. She wore a flowing gown, her hands clasped together in front of her. But it was her. It had always been her. And she was crying. "Ethan," she whispered. "They will never let us be." His heart pounded. He wanted to go to her, to reach out and touch her, to tell her that nothing, nothing, would keep them apart. But he couldn't move. He could only watch as her eyes filled with sorrow. "We are cursed," she said. Ethan's chest tightened. Cursed. Suddenly, the scene shattered. The marble floor cracked beneath his feet, the candles flickered violently, and a voice, asterisk asterisk deep, cruel, ancient, asterisk asterisk whispered from the darkness. "You will find each other, again and again, but you will never remember, you will never escape." The words wrapped around his throat, squeezing, suffocating. And then, he was back. Ethan gasped, nearly falling out of his chair. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. His hands trembled violently, the paintbrush slipping from his grip. He looked up. Lilith was staring at him. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her fingers still gripping her own brush. Her eyes were wide, glassy. She had seen it too. A heavy silence settled between them. Neither needed to say it. They had lived this before. And somehow, they had forgotten. Lilith was the first to speak, her voice hoarse. "This isn't the first time," she whispered. "We've done this before." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "The dreams," he murmured. "They weren't dreams." Lilith nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "They were memories." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The painting in front of him looked the same. And yet, something had changed. It felt fuller. Not just with color, but with truth. With history. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. Who had cursed them? Why? And more importantly, could they break it? His gaze locked onto Lilith's. She was thinking the same thing. Ethan exhaled, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "We need to find out the rest," he said. Lilith nodded. Because now, there was no turning back. Ethan and Lilith sat in silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a storm cloud about to break. Their paintings, unfinished no longer, seemed to pulse with something unseen, something alive. For the first time, they could feel it. The past. The curse. The truth. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Who did this to us? Lilith didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and traced the edge of her painting with a trembling finger. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I think we can find out." Ethan's gaze flickered to her, sharp, questioning. Lilith swallowed. "I have an idea." She hesitated. Then, softly, almost fearfully, she said, "We need to go back." Ethan frowned. "Back where?" Lilith's dark eyes lifted to his. "To the past." The idea sat between them, heavy and impossible. And yet, deep inside, Ethan knew it was the only way. The paintings had given them glimpses. But glimpses weren't enough. They needed to remember everything. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. "How do we do it?" Lilith hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think it's the paintings." Ethan followed her gaze to the canvases. There was something different about them now. The colors were richer, the details sharper, as if the paintings were no longer just art, but portals. Ethan swallowed hard. Something deep inside whispered that this was dangerous. That once they stepped through, there would be no coming back. But he met Lilith's eyes, and knew there was no other choice. They had been trapped in this cycle for centuries. It was time to break free. Ethan reached out, his fingers hovering over the painting's surface. Lilith did the same. A single breath. A moment of stillness. And then, the world shattered. They were falling. Not through air, not through time, but through something else. Something endless. Ethan's heart pounded, his body weightless as memories slammed into him, one after the other. A forbidden love. A betrayal. A punishment. A curse. He hit the ground with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there, dizzy, disoriented. Then, voices. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was no longer in his studio. He was in a castle. A place he had never seen, but knew too well. And standing before him, a man. Draped in robes of deep black, his eyes burning like embers in the dim candlelight. Ethan's breath hitched. He knew this man. This was the one who had cursed them. The one who had torn them apart. The sorcerer smiled. "Ah," he said, voice smooth as silk. "You're finally remembering. The past is no longer a dream. The truth is here. But can Ethan and Lilith survive it? If you're as deep into this mystery as they are, make sure to like and subscribe. The final chapter is coming. Now, let's continue." The air in the castle was thick, heavy with power, thick with old magic. Ethan felt it pressing against his skin, crawling into his lungs. Across from him, the sorcerer stood tall, draped in dark robes that swallowed the candlelight. And beside him, Lilith. She had landed only moments after Ethan, her breath still uneven, her eyes wide with realization. This was it. The moment everything had led to. The man before them was the key. Ethan clenched his fists. "Who are you?" The sorcerer smiled, slow and knowing. "Ah," he said, tilting his head. "After all this time, you still don't remember me?" Ethan's heart pounded. Something about that voice. That smirk. It stirred something inside him. A memory just beyond his reach. But before he could grasp it, Lilith stepped forward. "You cursed us," she said. It wasn't a question. The sorcerer's smile grew. "Yes," he said. "And I'd do it again." Ethan felt rage burn in his chest. He had no memory of this man, no understanding of why he had done this. But he didn't need to remember. He could feel it. The pain. The loss. Centuries of love, stolen. Lilith's voice was quiet, but firm. "Why?" The sorcerer's gaze flickered to her, and something changed in his expression. Something dark. Something familiar. "You really don't remember, do you?" he murmured. Then he raised a hand. A flash of light. And suddenly, the past swallowed them whole. A grand hall. The same one from Ethan's visions. Only this time, he was not watching. He was living it. He stood at the center of the room, dressed in royal garments. And across from him, Lilith. She was crying. But this time, he knew why. Because the man standing beside her, the sorcerer, was his brother. Ethan's breath caught. It all came back. The love he and Lilith had shared. The jealousy that had poisoned his brother's heart. The curse that had ripped them apart. Again and again and again. Ethan gasped as he was pulled back into the present. The castle, the sorcerer, Lilith. Everything came into focus. His brother was watching him, waiting. A challenge. Daring him to remember. And now, Ethan did. He remembered everything. Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "This ends now." The sorcerer chuckled. "Does it?" he asked. "How many times have you said that, brother?" Ethan ignored the words. Because this time, something was different. He had spent lifetimes forgetting, lifetimes being trapped in this cycle. But this time, he was awake. This time, he was ready. He turned to Lilith. She met his gaze, understanding flickering in her eyes. The curse had always worked because they had been separated. Because they had been broken. But now, they stood together. Hand in hand. A love that had survived centuries. And as they looked at each other, the air around them shifted. The sorcerer's smirk faltered. Power, ancient and unbreakable, rose between Ethan and Lilith, wrapping around them like fire. The curse cracked. The castle walls trembled. And then, with one final surge, it shattered. A blinding flash of light. And the sorcerer was gone. The silence was deafening. Ethan blinked. The castle was gone. The paintings were gone. They were back in the studio. Back in the present. Ethan turned to Lilith, his breath shaky. And when he looked into her eyes, he knew. They were free. At last. Centuries of love. A curse broken. But was it truly the end? If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will pull you in and never let go. The next tale awaits. Now, rest easy.